welcome. This is Brand New Rose Life in the Forbidden Library, and we're reading Pride and Prejudice again today. Hello everyone! Hello Noversize Phantom, hello Luke, hello Red Candy Guy, hello Void on Twitter, and hello Void on YouTube. Dolphins, some of the smartest animals in the world. Do they watch Brand New Rose? No, but they wish they did. That's how smart they are. God, you flatterer. You flatterer. Congrats on reaching affiliate. Yeah! We did it! We have buttons you can press on Twitch now. You can do wonderful things. You can take my glasses off. You can change the color of my rose. It's great. It's fun stuff. I was so excited to get those buttons. Good evening. Definitely forgot I was streaming today. That's fair. It is a lazy, lazy Sunday. It's easy to forget things on Sundays. Sunday's a forgetful day. I am good. I am a little tired. I had a big day of work today. I was very busy. You see, I work somewhere where somewhere now where it gets busier in the summer, and now the kids are out of school as well. It's a lot busier, so it was really busy today. So I'm a little tired today, but we're doing it. Hello, Monster Shard. Welcome, 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 welcome. Boy, what were we doing last Sunday? Good God, I don't know. Hello, Botrix. You have joined the channel. I don't know. With that name, are you an actual bot? Or are you someone who is not a bot? Still at the game store? No, I'm not at the game store anymore. I'm somewhere different now. Somewhat different now. I wish I was still at the game store, though. I did not want to leave that job. But anyway, shall we try and remember what happened last time we read Pride and Prejudice? So, the whole ordeal began when Mr. I'm really bad at remembering some of these names. He's not been in for a little bit. I will find this name. Bingley! Yes. This all began when Mr. Bingley moved into town. He moved into the Netherfield estate, you see. And in that time, the Mrs. Bennet was like, oh my, he seems like a well-to-do gentleman. Maybe I'll get to marry off one of my daughters to him. So they had a ball, and Mr. Bingley took a liking to a girl called Jane, one of Mrs. Bennet's daughters. He also has a friend, though, a rather not-to-do gentleman, known as Mr. Darcy. And Mr. Darcy gives a lot of offence. He is rather antisocial and very quick when you do not like him very much. Well, Mother tried to play horrible, horrible wingman. She sent Jane off to the Netherfield estate to see Mr. Bingley on a horse on her own without a carriage, knowing that it was going to rain. And because of this, Jane caught a terrible cold and couldn't leave the Bingley estate. Well, Elizabeth was having none of this. She wanted to go visit her sister, but her mother would not give her horses or the carriage, so she walked the entire way, trudged through fields, got real muddy, and ended up at the estate for a while to help look after her sister. During that time, she had many verbal duel with Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy totally doesn't like her. He totally doesn't like her. Totally not. Completely not. Absolutely loves her. He likes her, and he's terrified of that. So he's made it a point not to show her that. However, Jane has recovered, and they have returned home now. Walking, that's how you know it's the 1800s. Yep. They have returned home, and Mrs. Bennet is talking about how this guy is visiting, their cousin's visiting, because their cousin is actually next in line to inherit the estate after Mr. Bennet dies, which will leave the women a bit destitute. But it seems that the cousin has had a bit of a change of heart, and is trying to reassure them that he will look after them afterwards. Not because this is the 1800s, the women cannot inherit the estate, obviously. However, he can make sure they don't end up homeless should Mr. Bennet die. And I think that's about where we're up to in the very quick summary I can give. What happened? Yeah. When did Botrix join? Did you flip a switch, Bryony? Am I not good enough at modding? I have no idea what you mean. I don't know what Botrix is. There was just someone in the chat called Botrix. Oh. Hello, Jabba Hub. Welcome. You're here just in time for me to start the reading with chapter 14. Always takes me a moment with them Roman numerals. They're confusing. But anyway, during dinner time, they have the wrench and everything. I see. Reading time. During dinner, Mr. Bennet scarcely spoke at all, but when the servants were withdrawn, he thought it time to have some conversation with his guest. This guest being the cousin I told you about, just so's you're aware. Just so's you're aware. And therefore started a subject which he expected him to shine, by observing that he seemed very fortunate in his patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, attention to his wishes, and considerate for his comfort, appeared very remarkable. That would be the cousin's new wife. Mr. Bennet could not have chosen better. Mr. Collins was eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated him to more than usual solemnity of manner, and with a most important aspect he protested that he had never in his life witnessed such behaviour in a person of rank, such affability and condescension. He had himself experienced from Lady Catherine. She had been graciously pleased to approve of both the discourses which he had already had the honour of preaching before her. She had also asked him twice to dine at Rostings, and had sent for him only the Saturday before to make her pool of quadrille in the evening. Lady Catherine was reckoned proud by many people. He knew, but he had never seen anything but affability in her. She had always spoken to him as she would any other gentleman. She made not the smallest objection to his joining in the society of the neighbourhood, nor to his leaving his parish occasionally for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even consented to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion. Oh, so he's not actually married to her. It's like, it's a patronage. So she's like taking him in? Question mark? I thought they were married. And had once paid him a visit in his humble parsonage, where she had perfectly approved all his alterations he had been making, and had even vouched to suggest some herself. Old school patron pledge. Yeah, actual old school. Not a Patreon pledge, which I have, by the way, and you can check that out in the description. An actual just patron. Actual patron. What Patreon is based on. And had even, watch this, some shelves in the closet upstairs. That is all very proper and civil. Oi, 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 no you! How dare you say no backsies? My backsies is how I survive! Fine, I accept. But you're also cool. No backsies. Ha. That's all very proper and civil, I am sure, said Mrs. Bennet, and I dare say she's a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir? The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rossing Parks, her ladyship's residence. I think you said she is a widow, sir. Has she any family? She has one only daughter, the heiress of Rostings, and of very extensive property. Ah! cried Mrs. Bennet, shaking her head. Then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome? She is a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that. In point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of sickly constitution, which has prevented her from making that progress in many accomplishments which could not otherwise have failed of, as I am informed by the lady who superintended her education, and who still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to drive my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies. Has she been presented? I do not remember her name among the ladies at court. Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her from being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed pleased with the idea, and you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are the little kind of things which please her ladyship, and it is a sort of attention which I conceive myself particularly bound to pay. I like making sure she's happy by complimenting her daughter a lot. You judge very poorly, said Mr. Bennet, and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are the result of previous study? They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as they may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible. Bro, you are coming across a little bit sus now. 'Cause I like to think up compliments to make my patron happy when she's not looking at Papa John's jump scare. He's a little bit of sussy backer. I mean, compliments are all great and all, but when they're like calculated like this, it gives a little bit of a creepy air. Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was as absurd as he had hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining the same time the most resolute composure of countenance, and, except an occasional glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. Mr. Bennet's an ass too, though, as well, so it is really, really not surprising that he is enjoying talking to this man and his weird conniving compliments. By tea time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing-room again, and when tea was over, glad to invite him. Protested that he never read novels. Oh my, he doesn't read novels! Glad to invite him to read aloud to the ladies. Read aloud to the ladies! Hi ladies, I'm reading aloud to you. Mr. Collins readily assented, and a book was produced, but on beholding it, for everything announced it to be from a circulating library, he started back, and begging pardon, protested that he never read novels! Oh my! Calculated compliments, that's just called loading back to a previous save, knowing that your love interest is gonna respond with before they respond. I guess so. Doesn't read novels. He'd never survive inside the library. He really wouldn't. He would never get an invitation to be here. This is a Mr. Collins free zone, apparently. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia exclaimed. Other books were produced, and after some deliberation he chose Fordyce's sermons. Lydia gasped as he opened the volume, and before he had, with a very monitor's solemnity, read 3 pages, she interrupted him with a, "Do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Philip talks of turning away Richard? And if he does, Colonel Foster will hire him. My aunt told me so herself on Saturday. I shall walk with Meryton tomorrow to hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town." Oh yeah, so the 2 youngest of Miss Bennet's family have been off flirting with a bunch of soldiers who have been stationed here. And I believe, like, Colonel Foster's in charge of them. Imagine if your partner knew everything you were gonna do before you did it. I think that's actually slightly... It is! It's 100% creepy. That's why I say calculated compliments are creepy. Whether it's because of some weird time loop power, or generally because you're complimenting to keep someone on their good side kind of thing. It's not... Calculated compliments are bad. Manipulation, bro. Lydia was bid by her 2 elder sisters to hold her tongue, but Mr. Collins, much offended, laid aside his book and said, "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for their benefit. It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction. But I will no longer importune my young cousin." How dare they not like boring books as young ladies? That's so stupid. Some weird timely power. Undertale and Higurashi. Void spoilers. Void spoilers. Some people don't know that much about Higurashi. We're playing it in the thing. Spoilers. I know. How dare you be a teenager that's not entertained by boring crap sermons? Then, turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as this antagonist and backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, observing that he acted very wisely in leaving the girls in their own trifling amusements. Miss Bennet and her daughters apologized most civilly for Lydia's interruption, and promised that it should not occur again, if he would resume his book. But Mr. Collins, after assuring them that he bore his young cousin no ill will, and should never resent her behaviour as an affront, seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet, and prepared for backgammon. I will not read to those who are not interested. I will read to those who are not interested, whether they like it or not. We've done it before. We've had people in the chat have gone, oh, this is boring. I've read to them anyway. Cannot be stopped. Cannot be stopped. I can't believe these girls won't read Gravity's Rainbow. What is the youth coming to? Bro. Chapter 15. Mr. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society, the greatest part of his life having been spent under the guidance of an illiterate and miserable father. And though he belonged to one of the universities, he had merely kept the necessary terms without forming it as any useful acquaintance. The subjection in which his father had brought him up had given him originally great humility of manner, but it was now a good deal counteracted by the self-conceit of a weak head, living in retirement, and the consequential feeling of early and unpredicted prosperity. You just locked your arm around their neck and just read to them. Yeah, remember that? Yeah! A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when living of Hunsford was vacant, and the respect which he felt for her high rank, and his veneration for her as his patroness, mingling with a very good opinion of himself, of his authority as a clergyman, and his right as a rector, made him altogether a mixture of pride, this word, whatever that is, self-importance and humility. Having now a good house and a very sufficient income, he intended to marry, and in seeking reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by a common report. Obsequiousness. Yeah, it's definitely a word, that is for sure. This was his plan of amends, of atonement, for inheriting their father's estate, and he thought it an excellent one, full of eligibility and sustainableness, and excessively generous and disinterest on his own part. So basically he's like, I know how I can fix this weird issue with the inheritance. I'll just marry one of my cousins. Oh, don't you just love history? Don't you just love all the weird incestuous bits of history? The 1800s, man. Banjo intensifies. Correct. It's like my nan always said, be obsequious, purple, and clairvoyant. What a wise woman your nan was. Things were wild back then. They really were. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views, and established all his strictest notions on what was due to seniority. And for the first evening she was his settled choice. Which Bennet? They're all Miss Bennet. Is he gonna... Oh, 1 second. I gotta deal with a dude in the Twitter. We gotta... Ban. Yeah. I mean, things were wild right now. But we have Twitter, so we're numb to it all. That's true. Marry all the Bennets. Every Bennet, including Mr. Bennet. Gotta catch 'em all, Bennett, man. I can only assume that he's picked Jane, because it's kind of been established that Jane is the prettiest to Bennett. So, but obviously, Mr. Bingley also has his eye on Jane right now. But if he has, however, picked Elizabeth, will that trigger Mr. Darcy into making a move? I don't know. We'll find out. The next morning, however, made an alteration, for in a quarter of an hour's tete-a-tete with Mrs. Bennet before breakfast, a conversation beginning with his personage house and leading naturally to the ovals of his hopes, that a mistress for it might be found at Longbourn, produced from her, amid very complacent smiles and general encouragement, a caution against the very Jane he had been fixed on. As to her younger daughters, she could not take upon her say. She could not positively answer, but she did not know of any prepossession. Her eldest daughter, she just mentioned, she felt incumbent on her hint, was very likely to be soon engaged. Ah, Mum's got it. Mum's like, no, you can't have Jane. We've already booked her up. Oh, have a nice luck, Luke. You get comfy. I will read to you. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth, and it was soon done. While Mrs. Bennet was stirring the fire, Elizabeth, equally next to Jane in birth and beauty, succeeded her, of course. Mrs. Bennet treasured up a hint, and trusted that she might soon have 2 daughters married, and the man whom she could not bear to speak of the day before was now high in her good graces. Lydia's intention of walking to Meryton was not forgotten. Every sister except Mary agreed to go with her, and Mr. Collins was to attend them, at the request of Mr. Bennet, who was most anxious to get rid of him, and have the library to himself. For hither Mr. Collins had followed him after breakfast, and there he would continue, normally engaged with one of the largest folios in the collection, but really talking to Mr. Bennet with little concession of his house and garden at Hunsford. Such doings decomposed Mr. Bennet exceedingly. What a mood! Mr. Bennet's like, hey, why don't you take the guest out? Because he kept trying to talk to me while I was in the library and I hated it. Please take him out. In his library he had always been sure of leisure and tranquillity, and though prepared, as he told Elizabeth, to meet with folly and conceit in every other room of the house, he was used to being free from them here. His civility, therefore, was most prompt in inviting Mr. Collins to join his daughters in their walk, and Mr. Collins, being, in fact, much better fitted for a walker rather than a reader, was extremely well pleased to close his large book and go. While you're at it, suplex him through a table. In pompous nothings on his side, and civil assents on that of his cousins, their time passed till they entered Meryton. The attention of the younger ones was then no longer to be gained by him. Their eyes were immediately wandering up the street in quest of the officers, and nothing less than a very smart bonnet, indeed, or a really new muslin in a shop window, could recall them. 68 bits, thank you for it! So in some RPGs, fleeing erases enemies from existence. Does that mean that in real life, if you had this ability, would you be forced to talk to random people trying to make small talk with you, since fleeing from them will just erase them? Or will you not care that you'd erase people? That's terrifying. I suppose I'd have to up my social battery, because I don't want to accidentally erase people from existence by running away from them. I think I'd cry. Yeah. Because if they flee from me, then that's fine. So I might use the awesome power of white girl tears to make them go away. But the attention of every lady was soon caught by a young man, whom they had never seen before, of most gentlemanlike appearance, walking with an officer on the other side of the way. The officer was the very Mr. Denny, concerning whose return from London Lydia came to inquire, and he bowed as they passed. All were struck with the stranger's air. All wondered who he could be, and Kitty and Lydia, determined, if possible, to find out, led the way across the street, under pretence of wanting something in an opposite shop, and fortunately had just gained the pavement when the two gentlemen, turning back, had reached the same spot. Mr. Denny addressed them directly, and entreated permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham, who had returned with him the day before from town, and, he was happy to say, had accepted a commission in their corps. This was exactly as it should be, for the young man wanted only regimentals to make him completely charming. His appearance was greatly in his favour. He had all the best parts of beauty, a fine countenance, a good figure, and a very pleasing address. The introduction was followed up on his side by a happy redness of conversation, a redness at the same time perfectly correct and unassuming, and the whole party were still standing and talking together very agreeably, when the sound of horses drew their notice, and Darcy and Bingley were seen riding down the street. On distinguishing the ladies of the group, the two gentlemen came directly towards them, and began the usual civilities. Bingley was the principal spokesman, and Miss Bennet the principal object. He was then, he said, on his way to Longbourn, on purpose to inquire after her. Mr. Darcy corroborated it with a bow, and was being determined not to fix his eyes on Elizabeth. Darcy, accept it! Accept that this woman has sassed her way into your heart. Sounds like a great guy. Tears paper enough. Pisses me off. When they were suddenly arrested by the sight of the stranger, and Elizabeth happened to see the countenance of both as they looked at each other, was all astonishment at the effect of the meeting. Both changed colour, one looked white, the other red. Mr. Wickham, after a few moments, touched his hat at a salutation which Mr. Darcy just deigned to return. What could be the meaning of it? Oh, so Mr. Darcy has some beef with this new man. I see. It was impossible to imagine. It was impossible not to long to know. In another minute, Mr. Bingley, but without seeming to have noticed what passed, took leave and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips's house, and then made their bows, in spite of Miss Lydia presenting entreats that they would come in, and even in spite of Mrs. Phillips throwing up the parlour window and loudly seconding the invitation. Mrs. Phillips was always glad to see her nieces, and the two eldest, from their recent absence, were particularly welcome, and she was eagerly expressing her surprise at their sudden return home, which, as their own carriage had not fetched them, she should have known nothing about. If she had not happened to see Mr. Jones, shop-boy, in the street, who had told her that they were not to send any more draughts to Netherfield, because the Miss Bennets were come away, then her civility was claimed towards Mr. Collins by Jane's introduction of him. She received him with her very best politeness, which he returned with as much more, apologizing for his intrusion, without any previous acquaintance with her, which he could not help flattering himself, however, might be justified by his relationship to the young ladies who introduced him to her notice. Mrs. Phillips was quite awed by such an excess of good breeding, but her contemplation of one stranger was soon put to an end by exclamations and inquiries about the other, of whom, however, she could only tell her nieces what they already knew, that Mr. Denny had brought him from London, and that he was to have a lieutenant's commission in the shire. She had been watching him the last hour, she said, as he walked up and down the street, and had Mr. Wickham appeared, Kitty and Lydia would certainly have continued the occupation. But, unluckily, no one passed the windows now except a few of the officers, who, in comparison with the stranger, were become stupid, disagreeable fellows. Some of them were to dine with the Phillipses the next day, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham, and give him an invitation also, if the family from Longbourn would come in the evening. This was agreed to. Funny restaurant over Mr. Denny. I see. Auntie's on it. Auntie's like, well, I see this guy. I know you're happy with him. I'll invite him over, and then I'll invite you guys over, and then you can get on him, okay? By the end of this book, all of the Bennet girls are going to be married off by the looks of it. This was agreed to, and Mrs. Phillips protested that they would have a nice, comfortable, noisy game of lottery tickets, and a little bit of hot supper afterwards. The prospect of such delights was very cheering, and they parted in mutual good spirits. Mr. Collins repeated his apologies in quitting the room, and was assured the unwearying civility that they were perfectly needless. Mr. Collins gets nervous with strangers, from what I can tell. As they walked home, Elizabeth related to Jane what she had seen pass between the two gentlemen. But though Jane would have defended either or both had they appeared to be wrong, she could no more explain such behaviour than her sister. Mr. Collins, on his return, highly gratified Mrs. Bennet by admiring Mrs. Phillips's manners and politeness. He protested that, except Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never seen a more elegant woman, for she had not only received him with the utmost civility, but had even pointedly included him in her invitation for the next evening, although utterly unknown before her. Sometimes, he supposed, might be attributed to his connection with them, but yet he had never met with so much attention in the whole course of his life. Oh my God, Mr. Collins never had so much attention in his life. This poor man. Mr. Bennet's right. He's definitely a funny one. Where's the rest of my book? There it is. There's just some random blank pages, which is weird. Oh, here they are. Here's the girls. Chapter 16. As no objection was made to the young people's engagement with their aunt, and all Mr. Collins' scruples of leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bennet for a single evening during his visit were most steadily resisted, The coach conveyed him and his 5 cousins at a suitable hour to Meryton, and the girls had the pleasure of hearing, as they entered the drawing-room, that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation, and was then in the house. Oh my God, the hot man's in the house! When this information was given, they all had taken their seats. Mr. Collins was at leisure to look around him and admire, and he was so much struck with the size and furniture of the apartment that he declared that he might almost have supposed himself in the small summer breakfast parlour at Rostings, a comparison that did not first convey much gratification, but when Mrs. Phillips understood from him what Rostings was, and who was its proprietor, when she listened to the description of the one and only Lady Catherine's drawing-rooms, and found that the chimney-piece alone had cost £800, she felt the full force of the compliment, and would hardly have resented a comparison with the housekeeper's room. Mr. Wick's house. Yes, Mr. Wick's house. I wonder if there's guns anywhere. In describing to her all the grandeur of Lady Catherine and her mansion, with occasional digressions in praise of his own humble abode, and the improvements he was receiving, he was happily employed until the gentleman joined him, and he found in Mrs. Phillips a very attentive listener, whose opinion of his countenance increased with what she heard, and who was resolving to retell it all among her neighbours as soon as she could. I'm going to gossip the shit out of this, she thinks. To the girls, who could not listen to their cousin, and who had nothing to do but to wish for an instrument, and examine their own indifferent imitations of china on the mantelpiece, the interval of waiting appeared very long. It was over at last, however. The gentleman did approach, and when Mr. Wickham walked into the room, Elizabeth felt that she had neither been seeing him before, nor thinking of him since, with the smallest degree of unreasonable admiration. The officers of the shire were in general a very creditable, gentlemanlike set, and the best of them were of the present party, but Mr. Wickham was far beyond them all in person, countenance, air, and walk, as they were superior to the broad-faced, puffy, stuffy Uncle Phillips, breathing port wine, who followed them into the room. Oh, here are the gentlemen, the officers of the shire. So I assume this man in the coat, that must be Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham was the very happy man towards whom every female eye was turned, and Elizabeth was the very happy woman by whom he finally seated himself. Yay, she's got the attention of the hot man. How's Mr. Darcy gonna deal with this? Deal with this. Deal with this. You got it the first time. I feel like you're acting like it's difficult to read. I didn't... How do I explain how I tripped over the word even though I got it right the first time? I'm not acting or faking it. If that's what it feels like you're implying. I just wasn't sure I did it. Credible makes it spelt like, let me go back. Because there's a T in there and I didn't pronounce the T, my brain was like, wait, you didn't say that right, but I did say that right, and she's a dumb bum. That's why I ended up going creditable, because there was a T in there I didn't pronounce. But I didn't need to pronounce the T. It's fine. But my brain was like, it's not fine. Try it again, even though it was fine. Because brains are stupid. Do not knock my mic so much. Do-da, do-da. And the agreeable manner in which he immediately fell into conversation, though it was only on the being a wet night, and on the probability of a rainy season, made her feel that the commonest, dullest, most threadbare topic might be rendered interesting by the skill of the speaker. With such rivals for the notice of the fair as Mr. Wickham and the officers, Mr. Collins seemed to sink into insignificance. To the young ladies he certainly was nothing, but he had still at intervals a kind listener in Mrs. Phillips, and was, by her watchfulness, most abundantly supplied with coffee and a muffin. Poor Mr. Collins! Bro just disappeared to these ladies, and he wants to marry one of them. When the card tables were placed, he had an opportunity of obliging her, in return by sitting down to whist. "I know little of the game at present," said he, "but I shall be glad to improve myself, for in my situation of life—" Mrs. Phillips was very thankful for his compliance, but could not wait for his reason. Mr. Wickham did not play at whist, and with ready delight was he received at the other table between Elizabeth and Lydia. At first there seemed danger of Lydia's engrossing him entirely, for she was a most determined talker. But being likewise extremely fond of lottery tickets, she soon grew too much interested in the game, too eager in making bets and exclaiming after prizes, to have attention for anyone in particular. Allowing for the common demand of the game, Mr. Wickham was therefore at leisure to talk to Elizabeth, and she was very willing to hear him, though what she chiefly wished to hear, she could not hope to be told, the history of his acquaintance with Mr. Darcy. She dared not even mention that gentleman. Her curiosity, however, was unexpectedly relieved when Mr. Wickham began the subject himself. He inquired how far Netherfield was from Meryton, and, after receiving her answer, asked in a hesitating manner how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "Oh, we're gonna get the tea! I'm sure he'll be back with milk, just like Brainy." Yeah, I'm always back. I'm back like 4 or 5 times a week. "About a month," said Elizabeth, and then, unwilling to let the subject drop, added, "He is a man of very large propriety in Derbyshire, I understand." "Yes," replied Miss Wickham. "His estate there is a noble one, a clear 10,000 per annum. You could not have met with a person more capable of giving you certain information on the head than myself, for I have been connected with his family in a particular manner from my infancy." Not with the milk, though. Yeah, I'd probably forget the milk, low-key. I am the kind that would go out for milk, get distracted, and come back without milk. But have stories to tell afterwards. Second. No. Elizabeth could not but look surprised. "You may have been surprised, Miss Bennet, at such an assertion, after seeing, as you might, the very cold manner of our meeting yesterday. Are you much acquainted with Mr. Darcy?" "As much as I ever wish to be," cried Elizabeth warmly. "I have spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I think him very disagreeable." It's like the programmer show. You're not wrong. "I have no right to give my opinion," said Wickham, "as to his being agreeable or otherwise. I am not qualified to form one. I have known him for too long, and too well to be a fair judge. It is impossible for me to be impartial, but I believe your opinion of him would in general astonish, and perhaps you would not express it quite so strongly anywhere else. Here you are in your own family. Upon my word, I say no more here than I might say in any house in the neighbourhood, except Netherfield. He is not at all liked in Hertfordshire. Everybody is disgusted with his pride. You will not find him more favourably spoken of by anyone. I cannot pretend to be sorry, said Mr. Wickham after a short interruption, that he or that any man should not be estimated beyond their deserts, but with him I believe it does not often happen. The world is blinded by his fortune and countenance, or frightened by his high and imposing manners, and sees him only as he chooses to be seen. I should take him, even on my sight acquaintance, to be an ill-tempered man. Tell us how you really feel, Liz. She will. Lizzie holds nothing back. This girl has no filter. I do one task, forget my main goal is to get milk. Go home. Oh snap, I forgot the milk. Go back to the store, get the milk. Get distracted. Don't get the milk. Get halfway home, realize you needed the milk. But now you have too much stuff and now you have to go home. Wickham only shook his head. I wonder, said he, at the next opportunity of speaking, whether he is likely to be in this county much longer. I do not at all know, but I heard nothing of his going away when I was at Netherfield. I hope your plans in favour of the Shire will not be affected by his being in the neighbourhood. Oh no, it is not for me to be driven away by Mr. Darcy. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go. We are not on friendly terms, and it always gives me pain to meet him. But I have no reason for avoiding him, but what I might proclaim to all the world, a sense of very great ill-usage and most painful regrets at his being what he is. His father, Miss Bennet, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the best men that ever breathed, and the truest friend I ever had. And I can never be in company with this Mr. Darcy without being grieved to the soul by 1,000 tender recollections. His behaviour to myself has been scandalous, and I verily believe I could forgive him anything and everything rather than his disappointing the hopes and disgracing the memory of his father. Elizabeth found the interest of the subject increased, and listened with all her heart, but the delicacy of it prevented further inquiry. Mr. Wickham began to speak on more general topics, Meryton, the neighbourhood, the society, appearing highly pleased with all that he had yet seen, and speaking of the latter, especially with gentle but very intelligible gallantry. It was the prospect of constant society, and good society, he added, which was my chief inducement to enter the Shire. I know it to be a most reputable, agreeable corps, and my friend Denny attempted me further by his account of their present quarters, and the very great attentions and excellent acquaintance Meryton had procured them. Society, I own, is necessary to me. I have been a disappointed man, and my spirits will not bear solitude. I must have employment and society. A military life is not what I was intended for, but circumstances have now made it ineligible. The church ought to have been my profession. I was brought up for the church, and I should at this time have been in possession of a most valuable living, had it pleased the gentleman we were speaking of just now. Indeed, yes, the late Mr. Darcy bequeathed me the next presentation of the best living in his gift. He was my godfather, and excessively attached to me. I cannot do justice to his kindness. He meant to provide for me amply, and though he had done it, but when the living fell, it was given elsewhere. Good heavens! Cried Elizabeth. But how could that be? How could this be disregarded? Why do you not seek legal redress? There was just such informality in the terms of the bequest as to give me no hope from the law. A man of honour could not have doubted the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it, or treat it as merely a conditional recommendation, as to assert that I had forfeited all claim to my extravagance, imprudence, in short, anything or nothing. Certainly it is that the living became vacant 2 years ago, especially as I was of an age to hold it, and that it was given to another man, and no less certain it is that I cannot accuse myself of having readily done anything to deserve to lose it. I have a warm, unguarded temper, and I may, perhaps, have sometimes spoken my opinion of him and to him too freely. I can recall nothing worse, but the fact is that we are very different sorts of men, and that he hates me. Oh my! So from what I can glean from this mess of 1800s talk, is that Mr. Wickham was taken in by Mr. Darcy's father and promised to be looked after. However, when Mr. Darcy's father passed, Mr. Darcy was like, nah, it's my money now. I inherited it. This is mine. And considering there was no contracts or anything, there was nothing Mr. Wickham could do to get that back. Which is why they don't like each other. Yay! This is quite shocking. He deserves to be publicly disgraced. Some time or another he will be, but it shall not be by me. Till I can forget his father, I can never defy or expose him. And Mr. Wickham is a big old softy, and he's like, he reminds me too much of his dad, and it really makes me sad, as though I literally could not stand to see his face at the moment. Bro, you absolute soft pants. Yawn. Elizabeth honoured him for such feelings, and thought his handsome demeanour that ever he expressed them. Sounds like easy money he should give underhanded financial advice. Mr. Darcy definitely knew how to make money, that's for sure. But he's becoming more of an arse the more we learn about him. But what, she said after a pause, can have been his motive? What can have induced him to behave so cruelly? A thorough, determined dislike of me, a dislike which I cannot attribute in some measure to jealousy. Had the late Mr. Darcy liked me less, his son might have borne with me better. But his father's uncommon attachment to me irritated him, I believe. Very early in life, he had not a temper to bear the sort of competition in which we stood, the sort of preference which was often given to me. Yeah, I thought that might be the case. Where he's mad because his dad paid more attention to this kid that he adopted rather than him. Kids are mean like that, and it seems Mr. Darcy kept that as a thing all the way through. And yeah, this is a little bit of a sleepy bray. She worked hard today. I had not thought Mr. Darcy so bad as this. Though I have never liked him, I had not thought so very ill of him. I had supposed him to be despising his fellow creatures in general, but did not suspect him of descending to such a malicious revenge, such injustice, such inhumanity as this. After a few minutes of reflection, however, she continued, I do remember his boasting one day at Netherfield of the implacability of his resentments, of his having an unforgiving temper. His disposition must be dreadful. I will not trust myself on the subject, replied Wickham. I can hardly be just to him. Elizabeth was again deep in thought, and after a time exclaimed, to treat in such a manner the godson, the friend, the favourite of his father, she could have added. A young man, too, like you, whose very countenance may vouch for your being amiable. But she contented herself with, and one, too, who had probably been his own companion from childhood, connected together, as I think you said, in the closest manner. We were born in the same parish, within the same park. The greatest part of our youth was passed together, inmates of the same house, sharing the same amusements, objects of the same parental care. My father began life in the profession which your uncle, Mr. Phillips, appears to do so much credit to, but he gave up everything to be of use to the late Mr. Darcy, and devoted all his time to the care of the Pemberley property. He was most highly esteemed by Mr. Darcy, a most intimate, confidential friend. Mr. Darcy often acknowledged him to be under the greatest obligations to my father's active superintendence, and when immediately before my father's death, Mr. Darcy gave him a voluntary promise of providing for me. I am not convinced that he felt it to be much a debt of gratitude to him as of affection to myself. Unforgiving temper sounds like me. So if your parents adopted someone and they paid attention more to them than you, then you would cut them from the inheritance forever. How strange, cried Elizabeth. How abominable! I wonder what the very pride of this Mr. Darcy has not made him just to you, if from no better motive than he should not have been too proud to be dishonest. For dishonesty I must call it. It is wonderful, replied Wickham, for almost all his actions may be traced to pride. Pride has often been his best friend. It has connected him nearer with virtue than any other feeling, but we are none of us consistent, and in his behaviour to me there were stronger impulses than even pride. Can such abominable pride as his have ever done him good? Yes. It has often led him to be liberal and generous. It's to give his money freely, to display hospitality, to assist his temperaments, and to relieve the poor. Family pride and filial pride, for he is very proud of what his father was, have done this, not to appear to disgrace his family, to degenerate from the popular qualities, or lose the influence of the Pemberley house, is a powerful motive. He has also brotherly pride, which some brotherly affection makes him a very kind and careful guardian of his sister, and you will hear him generally cried upon as the most attentive and best of brothers. What sort of girl is Miss Darcy? He shook his head. I wish I could call her amiable. It gives me pain to speak ill of a Darcy, but she, too, much like her brother, very, very proud. As a child, she was affectionate and pleasing and extremely fond of me. I have devoted hours and hours to her amusement, but she is nothing to me now. She is a handsome girl, about 15 or 16, and I understand highly accomplished. Since her father's death, her home has been London, where a lady lives with her and superintends her education. After many pauses and many trials of other subjects, Elizabeth could not help reverting once more to the first and saying, "I am astonished at his intimacy with Mr. Bingley. How can Mr. Bingley, who seemed good-humoured itself, and is, I really believe, a truly amiable, in the friendship with such a man, how can they suit each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley?" "Not at all. He is a sweet-tempered, amiable, charming man. He could not know what Mr. Darcy is." "Probably not. But Mr. Darcy can please where he chooses. He does not want abilities. He can be a conversable companion, if he thinks it is worth his while, among those who are at all his equals in consequence. He is a very different man from what he is to the less prosperous. His pride deserts him, but with the rich he is liberal-minded, just, sincere, rational, honourable, and perhaps agreeable, allowing something for fortune and figure." The whilst party soon afterwards breaking up, the players gathered around the table, and Mr. Collins took his station between his cousin Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. The usual inquiries as to his success were made by the latter, but it had not been very great. He had lost every point. But when Mrs. Phillips began to express her concern thereupon, he assured her, with much earnest gravity, that it was not the least importance, that he considered the money as a mere trifle, and begged that she would not make herself uneasy. "I know very well, madame," said he, "that when persons sit down to a card-table, they must take their chance of these things, and happily. I am not in such circumstances as to make 5 shillings any object. There are undoubtedly many who could not say the same, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, I am removed far beyond the necessity of regarding little matters." "I'm rich, bitch. Well, no, I have a sugar mama, and I can deal with this," he says. Mr. Wickham's attention was caught, and after observing Mr. Collins for a few moments, he asked Elizabeth in a low voice whether her relations were intimately acquainted with the family of de Bourgh. "Lady Catherine de Bourgh," she replied, "has very lately given him a living. I hardly know how Mr. Collins was first introduced to her notice, but he certainly has not known her long. You know, of course, that Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters. Consequently, that she is aunt to the present Mr. Darcy." "Oh, my! No, indeed, I did not. I knew nothing at all of Lady Catherine's connections. I never heard of her existence till the day before yesterday. Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will have a very large fortune, and is believed that she and her cousin will unite the 2 estates." This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Oh yeah, because like Mr. Bingley's sister, Miss Bingley, was all over Mr. Darcy. But Mr. Darcy is basically booked up by the sounds of it. He has engagements with another lady, so it would seem. This information made Elizabeth smile, as she thought of poor Miss Bingley. Vain indeed must be all her attempts, vain and useless her affection for his sister, and her praise of himself, if he were already self-destined to another. "Mr. Collins," said she, "speaks highly of both Lady Catherine and her daughter, but From some particulars that he has revealed of her ladyship, I suspect his gratitude misleads him, and that, in spite of her being his patroness, she is an arrogant and conceited woman. I believe her to be both in great degree, replied Wickham. I have not seen her for many years, but I very well remember that I never liked her, and that her manners were dictatorial and insolent. She has the reputation of being remarkably sensible and clever, but I rather believe that she derives part of her abilities from her rank and fortune, part from her authoritative manner, and the rest from the pride of her nephew, who chooses that everyone connected with him should have an understanding of the first class. Elizabeth allowed that he had given a very rational account of it, and they continued talking together with mutual satisfaction till supper put an end to cards, and gave the rest of the ladies their share of Mr. Wickham's attentions. There could be no conversation in the noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party, but his manners recommended him to everybody. Whatever he said was said well, and whatever he did, done gracefully. Elizabeth went away with her head full of him. She could think of nothing but Mr. Wickham, and of what he had told her, all the way home, but there was not time for her to even mention his name, as they went, for neither Lydia nor Mr. Collins were once silent. Lydia talked incessantly of lottery tickets, of the fish she had lost and the fish she had won, and Mr. Collins, in describing the civility of Mr. and Mrs. Phillips, protesting that he did not in the least regard his losses at whist, encumbering all the dishes at supper, and repeatedly fearing that he crowded his cousins, had more to say than he could well manage before the carriage stopped at Longbourn House. So she never got to spill the tea. Delighted to see her dear friend again. Ooh. Who delighted to see who? Shall we find out in chapter 17. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, and yet it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Mr. Wickham. The possibility of his having really endured such unkindness was enough to interest all her tender feelings, and nothing therefore remained to be done but to think well of them both, to defend the conduct of each, and throw into the account of accident or mistake whatever could not be otherwise explained. Why do you spill tea? That's a waste. It is a waste, but metaphorical tea is okay. As long as it's metaphorical, we're fine. They have both, said she, been deceived, I dare say, in some way or another, of which we can form no idea. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each other. It is, in short, impossible for us to conjecture the causes or circumstances which may have alienated them, without actual blame on either side. Yeah, 'cause there's a possibility this could all be meddling from Lady Catherine. Maybe it's a case of Lady Catherine convinced Darcy to keep the stuff. Maybe Darcy doesn't hate him that much, but Lady Catherine fueled the fire. Did she? Very true indeed. And now, my dear Jane, what have you got to say in behalf of the interested people who have probably been concerned in the business? Do clear them, too, or we shall be obliged to think ill of somebody. Laugh as much as you choose, but you will not laugh me out of my opinion, my dearest Lizzie. Do but consider what a disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy, to be treating his father's favouritism in such a manner, one whom his father had promised to provide for. It is impossible. No man of common humanity, no man who had any value for his character, could be capable of it. Can this most intimate friends be so excessively deceived in him? Oh, no. I could much more easily believe Mr. Bingley's being imposed on than that Mr. Wickham should invent such history of himself as he gave me last night. Names, facts, everything mentioned without ceremony. If it be not so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in his looks. It is difficult indeed. It is distressing. One does not know what to think. I beg your pardon, one knows exactly what to think. But Jane could think with certainty on only one point, that Mr. Bingley, if he had been imposed on, would have much to suffer when the affair became public. The two young ladies were summoned from the shrubbery where this conversation passed by the arrival of some very persons whom they had been speaking. Mr. Bingley and his sisters came to give their personal invitation for the long-expected ball in Netherfield, which was fixed for the following Tuesday. The two ladies were delighted to see their dear friend again, called it an age since they had met, and repeatedly asked what she had been doing with herself since their separation. To the rest of the family they paid little attention, avoiding Mrs. Bennet as much as possible, saying not much to Elizabeth and nothing to all the others. They were soon gone again, rising from their seats with an activity which took their brother by surprise, and hurrying off as if eager to escape from Mrs. Bennet's civilities. The prospect of the Netherfield ball was extremely agreeable to every female of the family. Mrs. Bennet chose to consider it as given in compliment to her eldest daughter, and was particularly flattered by receiving an invitation from Mr. Bingley himself, instead of a ceremonious card. Jane pictured to herself a happy evening of society of her two friends and the attentions of their brother, and Elizabeth thought with pleasure of dancing a great deal with Mr. Wickham, and of seeing a confrontation of everything in Mr. Darcy's look and behaviour. I love Elizabeth's priorities here. It's like, yes, a ball. I really hope Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy get in a fight. I want to watch a fight. Lady Catherine didn't stop the fire. It was always burning. It's been one since the world's turning. Hi, Teller. Thank you for the raid. Yay! Raid. We got raided. Yeah. Mr. Bingley himself, instead of someone is called. Jane pictured Elizabeth thought of the happiness anticipated by Catherine and Lydia depended less on any single event or any particular person, for though they each, like Elizabeth, meant to dance half the evening with Mr. Wickham, he was by no means the only partner whom could satisfy them, and a ball was, at any rate, a ball, and even Mary could assure her family that she had no disinclination for it. Just got done reading some Dracula. You're very spooked. Legitimately feel as though you can faint. Oh my gosh, I haven't read Dracula. That's on my list of ones I definitely want to read. But it's fine. You've come here, and now we're gonna sip some tea and have some drama. We've got some safe things. They've been invited to a ball. It's nice and simple. You have Dracula is cool. It's definitely on my list. It might be our next Halloween book, maybe. While I have my mornings to myself, said she,
It is enough, I think, it is no sacrifice to join occasionally in evening engagements. Society has claims on us all, and I profess myself one of those who consider intervals of recreation and amusement as desirable for everybody. Elizabeth's spirits were so high on the occasion that, though she did not often speak unnecessarily to Mr. Collins, she could not help asking him whether he intended to accept Mr. Bingley's invitation, and if he did, whether he would think it proper to join the evening's amusement, and she was rather surprised to find that he entertained no scruple whatsoever on that head, and was very far from dreading a rebuke, either from the Archbishop or Lady Catherine de Bourgh, by venturing to dance. "I am by no means of opinion, I assure you," said he, "that a ball is of this kind given by a young man of character to respectable people can have any evil tendency, and I am so far from objecting to dancing myself, that I shall hope to be honoured with the hands of all my fair cousins in the course of the evening, and I take this opportunity of soliciting yours, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances especially. I prefer..." Wow, he's getting there quick. "My preference, which I trust my cousin Jane will attribute to right cause, will not to any disrespect for her." Elizabeth felt herself completely taken in. She had fully proposed being engaged by Wickham for those very dances, and to have Mr. Collins instead. Her liveliness had never been worse timed. There was no help for it. However, Mr. Wickham's happiness and her own was perforce delayed a little longer, and Mr. Collins' proposal accepted with good grace as she could. She was not the better pleased with his gallantry, from the idea it suggested of some more. It now first struck her that she was selected among her sisters as being worthy of being the mistress of the Hunsford parsonage, and of assisting to form the quadrille table at Rostings. In the absence of more eligible visitors, the idea soon reached to conviction, as she observed his increasing civilities towards herself, and heard his frequent attempt at a compliment on her wit and her vivacity, and though more astonished than gratified herself by this effect of her charms, it was not long before her mother gave her to understand that the possibility of their marriage was exceedingly agreeable to her. Elizabeth, however, did not choose to take the hint, being well aware that a serious dispute must be the consequence of any reply Mr. Collins might never make the offer. Until he did, it was useless to quarrel about him. Oh, lordy. She wants Mr. Wickham because he's the pretty man, but our cousin Mr. Collins is here trying to make some moves. God, the 1800s. She doesn't want to be... Well, actually, no. It doesn't matter to her whether she's related to her husband, but I'm going to believe that she just doesn't want to be related to her husband. Oh, but I hope this means Mr. Darcy gets jealous at the ball. I need to see that. I need to see her do 2 dances with Mr. Collins and then have Mr. Darcy, like, butt in, going like, no. She's mine. I need it. I need it in my life. If there had not been a Netherfield ball to prepare for and talk of, the younger Miss Bennet would have been in a pitiable state at this time, for from the day of the invitation to the day of the ball, there was such a success of rain as prevented her walking to Merton once. No aunt, no officers, no news could be sought after. The very shoe roses for Netherfield were got by proxy. Even Elizabeth might have found some trial of her patience in weather which totally suspended the improvements of her acquaintance with Mr. Wickham. And nothing less than a dance on Tuesday could have made such a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday endurable to Kitty and Lydia. It's ball time! Till Elizabeth entered the drawing-room at Netherfield, and looked in vain for Mr. Wickham among the cluster of red coats there assembled. A doubt of his being present had never occurred to her. Oh, you sweetie! I mean, he was probably not invited because Mr. Darcy hates him, obviously. The certainty of meeting him had not been checked by any of those recollections that might not unreasonably have alarmed her. She had dressed with more than usual care, and prepared the highest spirits for the conquest of all that remained unsubdued of his heart, trusting that it was not more than might be won in the course of the evening. But an instant arose the dreadful suspicion of his being purposely omitted for Mr. Darcy's pleasure in the Bingleys' invitation to the officers, and though this was not exactly the case, the absolute fact of his absence was pronounced by his friend Mr. Denny, to whom Lydia eagerly applied, and whom told them that Wickham had obliged to go to town on business the day before, and was not yet returned, adding with a significant smile, "I do not imagine his business would have called him away just now, if he had not wished to avoid a certain gentleman here." Yeah, so it might not even been a case of him not being invited. It might have actually been a case of Mr. Wickham going, "You mean that place where Darcy is?" "Yeah, nah, mate." "Hello, Yeetgard, welcome. It has been a little while. Welcome back." This was part of his intelligence, though unheard by Lydia, was caught by Elizabeth, and, as it assured her that Darcy was not less answerable for Wickham's absence than if her first surmise had been just, every feeling of displeasure against the former was so sharpened by immediate disappointment that she could hardly reply with tolerable civility to the polite inquiries which he directed after approached to make. Oh, so she's very sad Mr. Wickham isn't there. And she's like, "Oh, why am I even here?" Attention, forbearance, patience with Darcy was injury to Wickham. She was resolved against any sort of conversation with him, and turned away with a degree of ill humour which she could not wholly surmount, even in speaking to Mr. Bingley, whose blind partiality provoked her. But Elizabeth was not formed for ill humour, and though every prospect of her own was destroyed for the evening, it could not dwell long on her spirits, and having told all her griefs to Charlotte Lucas, whom she had not seen for a week, she was soon able to make voluntary transition to the oddities of her cousin, and to point him out to her particular notice. The two first dances, however, brought the return of distress. They were dances of mortification. Mr. Collins' awkward and solemn apologies instead of attendance, and often moving wrong without being aware of it, gave her all the shame and misery which a disagreeable partner for a couple of dances can give. The moment of her release from him was ecstasy. Oh, God. So not only is he her cousin, not only is he a whipped man of a patroness lady, he's also bad at dancing. Could Mr. Collins be any more undesirable? She danced next with an officer, and had the refreshment of talking of Mr. Wickham, and of hearing that he was universally liked. When those dances were over, she returned to Charlotte Lucas, and was in conversation with her, when she found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy, who took her so much by surprise in his application for her hand, that without knowing what she did, she accepted him. Oh lordy, oh lordy. He walked away again immediately, and she was left to fret over her own want of presence of mind. Charlotte tried to console her. I dare say you will find him very agreeable. Heaven forbid! That would be the greatest misfortune of all, to find a man agreeable whom one is determined to hate. Do not wish me such an evil. When the dancing recommenced, however, and Darcy approached to claim her hand, Charlotte could not help but cautioning her, in a whisper, not to be a simpleton, and allow her fancy for Wickham to make her appear unpleasant in the eyes of a man, oftentimes his consequence. Elizabeth made no answer and took her place in the set, amazed by the dignity to which she was arrived in being allowed to stand opposite to Mr. Darcy, and reading in her neighbours' looks their equal amazement in beholding it. Oh my, Mr. Darcy wants to dance, and he picked Elizabeth, whom he called plain a long time ago. Oh my. They stood for some time without speaking a word, and she began to imagine that their silence was to last through the two dances, and at first was resolved not to break it, till suddenly, fancying that it would be the greater punishment to her partner to oblige him to talk, she made some slight observations on the dance. He replied, and was again silent. After a pause of some minutes, she addressed him a second time with, "It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some kind remark on the size of the room or the number of couples." He smiled and assured her that whatever she wished him to say should be said. Very well. That reply will do for the present. Perhaps, by and by, I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones. But now we may be silent. Shut up, woman. Okay. Do you talk by rule then while you are dancing? Sometimes one must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together, and yet for the advantage of some conversation ought to be arranged as they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible. Are you consulting your own feelings in the present case, or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine? Both, replied Elizabeth archly, for I have always been a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are each of an unsociable tactum disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room, and to be handed down to posterity with all the eclat of proverb. This is no very striking resemblance of your own character, I am sure, he said. Now near it may be to mine. How near it be to mine, I cannot pretend to say. You think it a faithful portrait, undoubtedly. She's like, yeah, we're both kind of smart asses that like to not talk unless, we can wow the whole room. And he's like, is that right? I don't want to take this insult. I must not decide on my own performance. He made no answer, and they were again silent till they had gone down the dance. When he asked her if she had her sisters did not very often walk to Meryton, she answered in the affirmative, and, unable to resist the temptation, added, "When you met us there the other day, we had been forming a new acquaintance." The effect was immediate. A deeper shade of hauteur overspread his features red. I believe he's blushing. And he said not a word. And Elizabeth, though blaming herself for her own weakness, could not go on. At length Darcy spoke in a constrained manner and said, Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he may be equally capable of retaining them is less certain. He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship, replied Elizabeth with emphasis, and in a manner which he is likely to suffer from all his life. Darcy made no answer, and seemed desirous of changing the subject. At the moment, Sir William Lucas appeared close to them, meaning to pass through the set of the other side of the room, but on perceiving Mr. Darcy, he stopped with a low bow of superior courtesy, to compliment him on the dancing of his partner. I have been most highly gratified indeed, my dear sir. Such very superior dancing is not often seen. It is evident that you belong to the first circles. Allow me to say, however, that your fair partner does not disagree with you, and that I must hope to have the pleasure often repeated, especially when a certain desirable event, my dear Eliza, glancing at her sister and Bingley, shall take place. What congratulations will then flow in? I appealed to Mr. Darcy, but let me not interrupt you, sir. You will not thank me for detaining you from the bewitching converse of that young lady, whose bright eyes are also unabriding to me. Oh my. This is very superior dancing. It's not often seen. Basically, Mr. Darcy's like, yeah, she's great, bro. The latter part of this address was scarcely heard by Darcy, but Mr. William's allusions to his friend seemed to strike him forcibly, and his eyes were directed with a very serious expression towards Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. Recovering himself, however, shortly, he turned to his partner and said, Sir William's interruption has made me forget what we were talking of. I do not think we were speaking at all. Sir William could not have interrupted any two people in the room who had less to say for themselves. We have tried 2 or 3 subjects without success, and what we are to talk of next I cannot imagine. What do you think of books? He said, smiling. Books! Oh, no. I am sure we never read the same, or not with the same feelings. I am sorry you think so, but if that be the case, there can be no want of subject. We may compare our different opinions. No, I cannot talk of books in the ballroom. My head is always full of something else. The present always occupies you in such scenes, does it? He said with a look of doubt. These two, honestly. Yes, always, she replied, without knowing what she said, for her thoughts had wandered far from the subject, as soon afterwards appeared by her suddenly exclaiming, I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, and that your resentments once created was impassable. You are very cautious, I suppose, as to its being created? I am. You said can be at least 3 times. I'm just reading what's on the page. I am, said he with a firm voice. And never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice? I hope not. It is particularly incumbent on those who never change their opinion to be secure of judging properly at first. May I ask to what these questions intend? Merely to the illustration of your character. said she, endeavouring to take off her gravity. "I am trying to make it out." "And what is your success?" She shook her head. I do not get on at all. I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly." "I can readily believe," answered he gravely, "that reports may vary with respect to me, and I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment, as there is reason to fear that performance would reflect no credit on either." But if I do not take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity." "I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours," he coldly replied. She said no more, and they went down the other dance and parted in silence, on each dissatisfaction, though not to an equal degree, for in Darcy's breast there were a tolerably powerful feeling towards her, which soon procured her pardon and directed all his anger against another. They had not long separated when Miss Bingley came towards her, and, with an expression of civil disdain, thus accosted her: "So, Miss Eliza, I hear that you are quite delighted with George Wickman. Your sister has been talking to me about him, and asked me 1,000 questions, and I find the young man forgot to tell you among his other communications that he was the son of old Wickman, the late Mr. Darcy's steward. Let me recommend you, however, as a friend, not to give implicit confidence to all his assertions, for, as to Mr. Darcy's using him ill, it is perfectly false, for, on the contrary, he has been always remarkably kind to him, and though George Wickman has treated Mr. Darcy in an most infamous manner, I do not know the particulars, but I know very well that Mr. Darcy is not in the least to blame, that he cannot bear to hear George Wickman mentioned, and that though my brother thought he could not well avoid including him in his invitation to the officers, he was excessively glad to find that he had taken himself out of the way. His coming to the country at all was a most insolent thing indeed, and I wonder how he could presume to do it. I pity you, Miss Eliza, for this discovery of your favourite's guilt, but really, considering his descent, one could not expect much better." "His guilt and his descent appear by your account to be the same," said Elizabeth angrily. "Why does George Wickman remind you of John Wick?" "Because any word Wick is going to remind you of John Wick." But really, he's done literally nothing to remind you of the character other than the name. He died. That's the only thing George Wickman's done. "For I have heard you accuse him of nothing worse than being the son of Mr. Darcy's steward, and of that I can assure you he informed me himself." "I beg your pardon," replied Miss Bingley, turning away with a sneer. "Excuse my interference. It was kindly meant." "Insolent girl," said Elizabeth to herself. "You are much mistaken if you expect to influence me by such a paltry attack as this. I see nothing in it but your own wilful ignorance and the malice of Mr. Darcy." She then sought her elder sister, who had undertaken too many inquiries on the same subject of Bingley. Jane met her with a smile of such sweet complacency, a glow of such happy expression, and sufficiently marked how well she was satisfied with the occurrences of the evening. Elizabeth instantly read her feelings, and at that moment solicitude for Wickman, resentment against his enemies, and everything else gave way before the hope of Jane's being in the fairest way for happiness. "I want to know," she said, with a countenance no less smiling than her sister's, "what you have learnt about Mr. Wickman. Perhaps you have been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third person in which you may be sure of my pardon." So, do you have any goss for me, sis? Or have you been too distracted by your future husband? I would forgive you for that, though. "No," replied Jane. "I have not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history, and is quite ignorant to the circumstances which have principally offended Mr. Darcy. But he will vouch for good conduct, the probity of honour of his friend, and is perfectly convinced that Mr. Wickham has deserved much less attention from Mr. Darcy than he has received. And I am sorry to say that by his account, as well as his sister's, Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man. I am afraid that he has been very imprudent, and has deserved to lose Mr. Darcy's regard." Imagine being too distracted to goss. I can understand that. There was this event when I first started dating my boyfriend. There was this event we went to, and I completely missed a lot of the drama that was going on because we were too busy being a lovey-dovey couple. "Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself. No, nor ever saw him till the other morning at Meryton. This account, then, is what he has received from Mr. Darcy. I am perfectly satisfied, but what does he say of the living?" "He does not exactly recollect the circumstances, though he has heard them from Mr. Darcy more than once. But he believes that it was left to him conditionally only." Imagine loving your boyfriend too much to be bothered by other people's drama. It's the way to live, guys, honestly. "I have not a doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity," said Elizabeth warmly, "but you must excuse my not being convinced by assurances only. Mr. Bingley's defence of his friend was a very amiable one, I dare say, but since he is unacquainted with several parts of the story, and has learned the rest from that friend himself, I shall venture still to think of both gentlemen as I did before." She then changed the discourse to one more gratifying to each, and on which there could be no difference of sentiment. Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy though modest hopes which Jane entertained of Mr. Bingley's regard, and said all in her power to heighten her confidence in it, on their being joined by Mr. Bingley himself. Elizabeth drew to Miss Lucas, to whose inquiry after the pleasantness of her last partner she had scarcely replied, before Mr. Collins came up to them. Mr. Collins, go away, Mr. Collins. And told her with great exultation that he had been so fortunate as to make a most important discovery. "I have found out," said he, "by a singular accident, that there is now in the room a near relation to my patroness. I happened to overhear the gentleman himself mentioning the young lady who does the honours of his house, the names of his cousins, Miss de Borough, and of the mother, Lady Catherine. How wonderfully these things occur! Who would have thought of my meeting with perhaps a nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in this assembly? I am most thankful that the discovery is made in time for me to pay my respects to him, which I am now going to do, and trust he will excuse my not having done it before. My total ignorance of the connection must plead my apology. This bro apologizes for breathing at this point. Jesus Christ, Mr. Collins. But also, this is hilarious. He is the nephew of your patroness, who also fancies the person you want to make your wife, my dear friend. You are screwed. You are not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy? Indeed I am. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done it earlier. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew. It will be in my power to assure him that her ladyship was quite well yesterday's night. Elizabeth tried to dissuade him from such a scheme, assuring him that Mr. Darcy would consider his addressing him without introduction as an impertinent freedom rather than a compliment to his aunt, that it was not in the least necessary there should be any notice on either side, and that if it were, it must belong to Mr. Darcy, the superior in consequence, to begin the acquaintance. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So many societal rules, bro. You can't just go up and talk to a guy. You just can't. He has to talk to you because society. Mr. Collins listened to her with the determined air of following his own inclinations, and when she ceased speaking, replied thus: My dear Miss Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world of your excellent judgment, in all matters within the scope of your understanding, but permit me to say that there must be a wide difference between the establishing forms of ceremony amongst the laity and those which regulate the clergy. For, give me to observe that I consider the clerical office as equal in point of dignity with the highest rank in the kingdom, provided that proper humility of behaviour is at the same time maintained. You must therefore allow me to follow the dictates of my conscience on this occasion, which led me to perform what I look on as a point of duty. Pardon me for neglecting to profit by your advice, which on every other subject shall be my constant guide, though this really feels like a actually, Miss Elizabeth. Jesus Christ. Collins, you can't just go and talk to someone. Exactly. Why is that even a societal rule to begin with? I want to be approached because I'm introverted to approach. Because high society has so many rules. We don't know why, it just kind of happened. I love this. Pardon me for neglecting to profit by your advice, which in every other subject shall be my constant guide. Basically, I don't want to listen to you this time, but I will totally listen to you every other time. Of course I will. You're my wife. You're my future wife. Of course I will listen to you. Please don't hate me for this. I want to marry you, but I'm not listening to you right now. Astra and decent. Gatekeeping. Yes, a lot of it is gatekeeping. You are correct. A lot of high society nonsense is gatekeeping. Though in this case, before us, considered habitual study. Consider myself more fitted by education and habitual study to decide on what is right than a young lady like yourself. Let me make my mistake, woman. Fucking wild. That was a hell of a speech. With a low bow, he left her to attack Mr. Darcy. And I also love that turn of phrase as well. He left her to attack Mr. Darcy. Ugh. Whose reception of his advances she eagerly watched, and whose whose astonishment at being so addressed was very evident. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though she could not hear a word of it, she felt as if hearing it all, and saw in the motion of his lips the words apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh. It vexed her to see him expose himself to such a man. Mr. Darcy was eyeing him with unrestrained wonder, and when, at last, Mr. Collins allowed him to speak, replied with an air of distinct civility. Mr. Collins, however, was not discouraged from speaking again, and Mr. Darcy's contempt seemed abundantly increasing with the length of his second speech, and at each of it he only made a slight bow, and moved for another away. Mr. Collins then returned to Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy said, "What is this peasant talking to me for? Please leave." Makes it sound like he's running up to him with a battle axe. He is a social battle axe, and we dislike those. "I have no reason, I assure you," said he, "to be dissatisfied with my reception. Mr. Darcy seemed much pleased with the attention. He answered me with the utmost civility, and even paid me the compliment of saying that he was so well convinced of Lady Catherine's discernment as to be certain she could never bestow a favour unworthily. It was really a very handsome thought. Upon the whole, I am much pleased with him." Mr. Collins gives the vibes of that guy who just can't read the room. Maybe a little bit of a tism vibe. Maybe just not great at social aspects. But oh, Mr. Collins, poor Mr. Collins. As Elizabeth had no longer any interest of her own to pursue, she turned her attention almost entirely on her sister and Mr. Bingley, and the train of agreeable reflections which her observation gave birth to made her perhaps as almost as happy as Jane. She saw her in ideas settled in that very house, in the felicity which a marriage of true affection could bestow, and she felt capable, under such circumstances, of endeavouring even to like Bingley's two sisters. Her mother's thoughts, she plainly saw, were bent the same way, and she determined not to venture near her, lest she might hear too much. When she sat down to supper before, she considered it a most unlucky perverseness, which placed them within one of each other, and deeply was vexed to find that her mother was taking that one person, Lady Lucas, freely, openly, and of nothing else but her expectation that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley, and was an animating subject. And Mrs. Bennet seemed incapable of fatigue while enumerating the advantages of the match. I realise we're past the 2-hour mark, but I need to find a good place to stop, or I will get back to it next week and I'll be like, where the fuck was I? So we're going to keep reading until we find a good place to stop. This being such a charming young man, and so rich, and living but 3 miles from them, there were the first points of self-gratulation. And then it was such a comfort to think how fond the two sisters were of Jane, and to be certain that they must desire the connection as much as she do. It was, moreover, such a promising thing for her young daughters, as Jane marrying so greatly must throw them in the way of other rich men. And lastly, it was so pleasant at her time of life to be able to consign her single daughters to the care of their sister, that she might not be obliged to go into company more than she liked. It was necessary to make this circumstance a matter of pleasure, because on such occasion it is the etiquette, but no one was saying less likely than Mrs. Bennet to find comfort in staying at home at any period of her life. She concluded, with many good wishes, that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, though evidently and triumphantly believing there was no chance of it. Basically, she was showing off to the other mum and basically going, my daughter caught Bingley. Yours will hopefully find someone for her. Ho, 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 ho. Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet. I think we can stop there, though. I flicked to this page and there was no paragraphs. No paragraph breaks. And I was like, shit. I can't stop there. But now I can. We can rest my voice slightly. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, everyone in chat. Thank you, everyone in lurk. Thank you, anyone who watches the VOD. I hope you enjoyed me talking some Pride and Prejudice at you. This has been fun. Like, the sass, whenever Elizabeth and Darcy actually manage to talk to each other, this book is on fire when that happens. It's so good. There is a very good reason this has become a classic, and that is why. They are sass masters. That is the best sass banter ever. Maybe not ever. I've seen some really good. How close is Moon 6 to being done? Not very. You're probably looking at end of the year. The sparks shall be flying. They do. They are an inferno together. The good reading. Thank you. If you have not already, I would highly appreciate it if you are on YouTube. If you could leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, because we are 53 subscribers away from 1K, which is bonkers. And you know what happens at 1K? I'm going to get 3D models and some ever so slightly jank 3D full body tracking. And then we're going to do a karaoke, and then we're going to do a subathon, and it'll be exciting. If you're on Twitch, I would appreciate it if you could follow the channel. That would be lovely. If you want to sub to it, that would be great too. That would be wonderful. Speaking of sub, there are many ways that you could make sure that I don't have to be tired from work during a stream like I am right now. You can join YouTube memberships where you get emotes, exclusive streams, the Discord channel, and merch discounts. You can get your ass on the Patreon where you can get short stories every month. You can get an exclusive stream and get merch discounts, and you can get free books. There is also the Kofi where you can throw money at me for no reason, or you could look into the shop and you could see some tiny baby audiobooks in there that I have read some of my short stories. And finally, last but not least, there is the merch store where you can get ebooks, first edition copies of books I've written, bookmarks, keyrings, t-shirts, a notebook, a pillow with my chibi on it, and last but not least, a sticker roulette of all my wonderful emotes. So go click all of those things, all of them, click them all for fun. It'll be great. You'll find great things, I promise. But other than that, I'm gonna go, 'cause I am sleepy. Bridie gotta go to bed. Night-night. I had fun. I hope you had fun. This has been Bridie with Life in the Forbidden Library. Goodbye.